for letting folks into the next in our long series of speaker series. And tonight is particularly special as it's a very good friend of mine who is just an extraordinary human being. And I want to tell you a little bit about Dr. Alan Karbelnig. Alan and I have known each other for a long time, and he is an intellectual, a very passionate psychologist, highly trained. He's an overachiever. He has not one but two PhDs, one in and carries a degree in psychoanalysis. He is an extremely well-respected psychologist and therapist in the Pasadena area. He's a graduate of USC and also from the Psychoanalytic New Center for Psychoanalysis. He is a published professional, many scholarly articles and 5 book chapters. He is a philanthropist and founded and serves on the board of directors and founded a nonprofit, the Rose City Center. Highly recommend that you investigate that. They really do some wonderful stuff, not-for-profit psychoanalytic psychotherapy for economically disadvantaged people. So he's very committed to the underserved, which is something that we feel very passionate about. And tonight he's going to talk about poverty and sort of building on Viktor Frankl's 1946 book, Man's Search for Meaning, comparing or how do we understand how people who just getting fresh water or surviving genocide or other climate or socio-political catastrophes, how do they find meaning in their life, and what can we understand about that? And then certainly it's a very appropriate topic. Sadly, it's a very appropriate topic. Just today, we have been learning about the further deterioration of things in Darfur with very bad activities on the part of some of the militants and genocide and climate issues and so forth. And of course, we're seeing some of this in Gaza and other places around the world. Tanzania, of course, is an impoverished country. It's relatively stable politically, but they have a very low GDP. And for those of us who've spent so much time over there, we're always so impressed with the grit and fortitude and passion that the Tanzanians can still show in spite of challenging circumstances. So it is my real honor to present Dr. Alan Karbelnig, and he has kindly offered to stay a little after and answer questions if you have any for him. So Alan, take it away.
Kim, thank you so much for inviting me. And I want you watching on Zoom to know that about 90% of what Kim said about me were complete and total lies. I'm going to begin with an overview of the talk. I certainly have a lot of expertise in meaning. When patients come to see me, one of my standard lines is, well, we'll work together to help you experience less suffering, and we're also going to help you to find out as much as we can about your authentic self, and that, of course, includes how you find meaning in life. I do not have much expertise in poverty. It was a little dicey for me in my early college years, living off of an alley in the Venice area when crime was really rather bad. But I can't say that I know much about it personally or professionally, but I did quite a bit of research for the talk today. And I do know a lot about psychology, obviously, and philosophy. So you'll hear some studies from me, some anecdotal information. I'm going to begin with providing a philosophical context for you, and that's mostly about existentialism, which I will explain. That's the philosophy that's really central to understanding how we humans seek and need to find meaning for our lives. Then I take you to 2 small journeys into psychology. Then I integrate these concepts into how to understand what the world of impoverished persons is like in terms of meaning. All of that in the 50-minute clinical hour. I will allow time for questions at the end, and you'll know when that time has come because I will say, well, that's our time for today. So now I'm going to take you into the realm of philosophy, and specifically existential philosophy. Interestingly, the millions of volumes in philosophy fall into 3 general categories: the good, the true, and the beautiful. And those 3 translate into ethics, metaphysics, and aesthetics. But you'll notice that none of those are really concerned with meaning or the meaning of human existence. And the whole realm of existentialism didn't really gain popularity until the post-World War II era. It has its origins in the late 19th and 20th century. Soren Kierkegaard in the early 19th century was a Christian philosopher who really made his name by talking about if you're going to accept Jesus as the God, as the Son of God, you have the freedom to make the choice yourself to believe that. A lot of Christians weren't too happy with him to have said that, but that's why he earns a place as one of the starters of the field. And then in the late 19th century, Nietzsche really anticipated existentialism with his emphasis on the individual subject. His idea of the Übermann, for example, which many people mistakenly associate with Nazism, was not really about that at all. It was about the developed person, the mature person knows who they are, what they need, what they desire, and they also have an ethic, but they're not living out someone else's life or what was prescribed for them. They're living out who they authentically are. And he likes to quote Pindar, whose saying was stolen by the United States Army. But Pindar, who was an ancient Greek poet, said, "Be who you are." Those 5 words, "Be who you are." And I'm going to come back to that later. Now, in the 20th century, I'm sure you'll recognize these names. Martin Heidegger and Jean-Paul Sartre were probably the biggest contributors in terms of developing and promoting existential philosophy. And then novelists like Fyodor Dostoevsky, who was earlier in time, Albert Camus, who was active in the 50s and 60s, would be considered writers who told tales that had highly existential themes, like the absurdity of life, freedom of choice, can you be who you really are, and so on. And what was the driver of this new branch of philosophy really flourishing? Well, it was the horrors of World War II, which shockingly overtook the horrors of World War I, but they will be nothing like the horrors of World War III. By the way, Albert Einstein said, I don't know what World War III will be like, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones. Side point there. Because of the Holocaust and understanding what happened 1944, 1945, and after the war, there was a lot of reflection on how could the most developed civilization on the planet had done something like that with the most science, the most advanced philosophy, linguistics, you name the field, music, have done a mass genocide unknown in human history. And that led to a lot of reflections on meaning. And that brings me to Viktor Frankl, who I envy because I've completed 1 book so far. He wrote Man's Search for Meaning in 6 weeks. And he was an Austrian neurologist who was in Auschwitz and then the Dachau concentration camps for a total of 3 years. He explored the psychology of the prisoners in that book. And what he observed was that the incarceratees who found their lives meaningful in some way were able to find loving relationships, care for their fellow prisoners, and could somehow translate their suffering into meaning they survived better, and those that did not had a higher likelihood of kind of giving up and succumbing to death. So an existentialist himself, Frankl really solidified the idea that we humans cannot not find our lives meaningful. He really heralded what Nietzsche had said earlier, which is, quote, the person who has a why to live can bear almost any how. I'm going to transition now to the final existentialist, and that is very famous quote from Albert Camus, the novelist, who wrote a book called The Myth of Sisyphus, which is a retelling of that tale of the fellow who has to roll the rock up the hill, watch it fall down the hill, scramble down the hill, push it back up the hill, and so on and so forth forever. The book begins with this radical statement: the only serious philosophical problem is whether or not to kill yourself. Now, that is meaningful because if you think about it, unlike the dog that was in this room until a few minutes ago, we humans understand that we could commit suicide. And therefore, Camus argues, when you wake up in the morning having decided not to kill yourself, well, why are you deciding to stay alive? What are you finding meaningful about your life? So that is my introduction to philosophy, existentialism specifically. And now I move on to two models of psychology, at least one of which I bet most of you have heard about. So the first one, these were introduced in the 40s and 50s of the last century, is Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which he develops in a kind of a pyramidal fashion. And at the very bottom of the level is basic physiological needs for food, shelter, water. I should clarify, these are not only his basic needs, but also what motivates people, what motivates people contributes to how people find meaning. So very bottom level, basic physiological requirements. The very next level is safety, including order, predictability, and control. The third layer is love and belongingness. I was so happy to be reminded that he had included this because I haven't looked him up for quite a while. And we are social animals, except for the slightly less than 1% that are psychopaths. And so love and belongingness is a very important part of our basic needs systems as humans. The fourth of the fifth is esteem. Concepts like worth, accomplishment, respect, values, I'm a virtuous person, etc. The last top one, which is one that few are able to achieve even in the wealthier countries, and that is to have what Maslow called self-actualization, the ability to really reflect on and understand who am I and how can I live my life to the fullest. And of course, Pindar's ancient statement, be who you are, is really all about self-actualization, but you cannot get to there until you've transcended the other four. There's no way around it. You can't like skip a couple grades like most of you probably did in high school. So the other theme from psychology is Erik Erikson's lifetime developmental model. There are endless developmental theories in psychology and psychoanalysis. Erik Erikson's one has retained a lot of popularity because it never really lost its valence And he was so wise to have thought of it in terms of every stage has a dichotomous struggle, like a dialectic, two basic ideas competing with one another. I'm not going to go through all of them for time considerations, but for example, the first year of life is basic trust versus mistrust. And this connects a lot to attachment theory, and of you that might be familiar with that, because if you do not have a good attachment experience in that first year of life, you're going to have a fault line in your personality that has to do with trust, not trusting. It's the etiology of things like borderline personality disorder, even psychosis if it's severe enough. Now I'm going to pop to adolescence, where Erickson talks about the dichotomous tension there is between identity versus role confusion. Do you get some kind of basic sense of who you are, or are you still confused about it? Uh, this is not on my list, but I can't help but add it here that see that transitions into 18 to 40, which is intimacy versus isolation. And that's all about, are you going to be able to find a partner or a community, or are you going to live a rather isolated life? And then one I will highlight later is probably most of our ages in this group, 40 to 65-ish. I think that should be extended to like 80. And that is generativity versus stagnation. I know Jane Goodall was one of your presenters. You don't have to tell me how old she is, Kim, but I think she's in her 80s, and she certainly is still in generativity mode. And the last one is, let's say, 80 and beyond, and that is integrity versus despair. Are you able to look back on your life with a sense of meaning and purpose, or are you going to be full of pain? My wife specifically advised me, Alan, you get into trouble when you go in these little side tangents, and she is completely correct. Nonetheless, I'm going to go on one right now, because in 1979 is when I did my first internship. I had no idea what I was doing. I have these fantasies of getting the names and addresses of those people and sending them, whatever amount they paid me. But I'll never forget, because I must have been 29 or 30, and this 63-year-old actor came in to see me who had never done more than bit parts. He was really poor. His social security income was limited, and he was full of despair at a life that he never had really fully grasped. And I remember having such a sense of pain for this guy. Now, a common problem of our era is young people failing to launch. I'll be writing one of my newsletters about that soon, because I have a couple of nieces living with my brother and his wife, and one is 29 and one is 31. And they are just not managing the identity versus role confusion, if you will. They're still kind of stuck one foot in childhood and immaturity. And imagine how bad poverty would affect any of these developmental stages. And I'll say more about that later in the talk. So having given you a taste of philosophy, introduced you to two basic models of psychology, one about motivation, one about development. Now I'm going to go into poverty, impoverishment. What do those words mean? It used to be defined by the World Health Organization and other UN entities as simply in terms of income degree or lack thereof. For some years now, they include a number of other factors. That's still part of the equation, but they look at like the definition of it includes things like hunger and malnutrition, limited access to educational and other basic services, social discrimination and exclusion, lack of participation in decision-making, personal insecurity, powerlessness, susceptibility to violence, living in marginal or fragile environments, and the inability to participate in normal social and or recreational life. Freud, who I always tell my patients, if I ever quote him, I'm not allowed to bring him up for another 6 months. Someone famously asked him, what is mental health? And he said, to love and to work. And since then, psychoanalysts then have added the idea to play. And that comes to mind because of we need all three. I'm not so sure about work anymore, but that's a whole other socialism commentary that I may or may not be invited by Kim to talk about. Now, how does impoverishment and all of these qualities I just mentioned affect the search for meaning? Well, many of them are self-evident, and I have absurdly categorized them into positive and negative qualities. And there's, of course, and I'm going to start with them so as to not leave you in too depressed of a state. Well, when you're at the bottom level of Maslow's hierarchy, all you can really think about is surviving, and that does become the meaning of your life. You also have no time to reflect on it, or probably even to talk to others about it. You are just thinking about survival every day. Finding shelter or enough food or water will occupy people's minds all the time. I have this perverse fascination with North Korea that I cannot explain. It must be a good example of the idea of the unconscious mind itself. I've read a number of books about it, and I know that during they've had at least 2 major famines. They may be having one right now. Maybe you know about that, Kim. People will do horrible things when they're starving. They will commit homicide. People that are otherwise like would be virtuous people in a safe, sustainable environment, financially sustainable environment, will kill to get food for themselves or their children. So it's kind of shocking what a lack of basic physical needs will do to the body, mind, and to meaning. Many other ways that meaning becomes distorted with poverty. Impoverished people have a disproportionate exposure to war. Even in the United States, there's a way higher number of poor people that end up going into the military just to be able to make a living than wealthy people volunteer. So the impoverished get exposed to violence of war more frequently than others. They get more exposed to racism. Related to racism is the impact of climate change, because the first countries in the world that are going to be affected, and some of them will literally disappear, are countries where primarily poor people are living. And the displacement related to climate change leads to immigration, frantic effects to leave their countries of origin, many of them resulting in mass deaths, as occurred just in the last few days in Europe. I don't know about you guys, but I'm really watching my consumption of news and trying to reduce it. This is something new I learned from prepping the talk tonight. when you're impoverished, your cognitive capacity will be adversely affected. There was a 2013 study that found that for poor individuals, their stressors create a cognitive strain equivalent to a 13-point deficit in their IQ, or the loss of more than one night of sleep, like considerable insomnia. And as a result, they'll behave in less capable ways. They'll lose their cognitive reasoning and judgment capacities, which then in turn further perpetuates their poverty. Totally different level now. If people live in countries that are victimized by warlords, countries like Somalia or Yemen, they're forced to survive in much more literal ways, like even basic needs like food, shelter, or water could become secondary to protecting themselves from attack by the warlords. And one wonders, perhaps those that work for the warlords or are enlisted by them find some kind of meaning in terms of being a warrior. Impoverished women around the world often find themselves constrained into traditionally feminine roles like parenting, cooking, and cleaning. In many countries like Afghanistan and for the most part Iran, they have no other choice. I don't know how many of you have heard of the phrase gender apartheid, but that is a phrase that is often used when talking about Iran or Afghanistan. The latter, particularly where women and girls are literally precluded from leaving the home without a male relative's permission, getting an education beyond, I think, it's sixth grade. It's horrible to think about. Furthermore, massive numbers of women and girls, sometimes boys, are forced into sexual slavery, much like the concentration camp experiences that Viktor Frankl wrote about. Perhaps these unfortunate people find meaning in hopes of liberation or planning ways of escaping. However, many give up and die or are killed by their captors. Additionally, when communities become discontinuous, which is not always the case, and that's, by the way, one of the positives I'll get to in a minute here, gangs develop because gangs provide alienated people, particularly kids, with a sense of family and belonging. And then you have the problem of gang competition, gang associated violence, and so on. And finally, and I meant to say at the very beginning, this is going to be an always incomplete list here. You have the problem of alcohol and substance abuse. In Africa specifically, a 2022 study showed that some 350,000 people die from the effects of alcohol and drugs. About half of those are from drugs. Kim, I bet you see this or hear about this. Drug abuse is an increasingly severe problem in Africa. The youth are particularly vulnerable because of their involvement in mass media and television. Some become involved in drug abuse and illicit drug trafficking to survive financially. And of course, this creates secondary problems like crime or killing your drug dealer competitors. I remember very early in my training, some professor or mentor was talking about heroin when you have like impoverished people, let's say in South Los Angeles, using heroin. And I did in college, I once had opiated hashish, and it was like being in a different world. Or there was a poet, blocking on his name, he was a buddy of Pablo Picasso's, and he was quite into opium. As soon as we're done tonight, his name will immediately pop in my mind, of course. But but he said, quote, something like, everything you do in life, no matter how happy you may feel, you are aware on some level that you're on a train headed toward death. To smoke opium is to get off the train, unquote. What this mentor taught me was that how do you take some poor kid in South LA with a crack addicted mom and no father who starts using heroin at age 12 and say, well, we could get you in a training program and then you could begin working at McDonald's. And maybe after 8 years, you could become a manager and you'd be making enough money to maybe live in an apartment with 5 other people. Like, how could that compete with the heaven feeling provided by these serious problematic drugs? Okay, so what could possibly be the positive effects of impoverishment? Well, surprisingly, there are a few. Many people embrace the religious and cultural traditions of their families and their communities, and they find a tremendous amount of meaning there. These two researchers, Oishi and Diener, in 2014, they used Gallup World Poll data studying 132 countries, where they examined how societal wealth correlates with finding meaning in life. Surprisingly, these researchers anyway found that people living in poor nations reported finding greater meaning in their lives than those living in wealthier nations. As I noted, they tended overall to find more meaning in their spiritual or religious belief systems. And these researchers, who also cited Viktor Frankl, concluded that people find meaning in their lives even when living in objectively dire conditions. So, depending on where they are geographically, and even within their individual, like let's say South LA, it really depends. I know from a friend of mine another psychologist in Pasadena, who grew up as a missionary's daughter in the Congo until she was 16 years old. She lived in this village where everybody knew each other. They would interact regularly at the marketplace. And I'll never forget what she said, this whole idea of, let's say, Kim, I ran into you on Fair Oaks one day walking, and in all likelihood, either you or I would say, great to see you, but I got to get to this meeting. And that phenomenon right there, this woman said, was totally alien to her, that in the village that she grew up, no, you would just sit and talk for a while. And there's a book I recommend by a guy named Sebastian Junger, Junger. The book is called Tribe. And he proposes that there's 3 features necessary for a meaningful life. One is a sense of purpose or meaning. One is a feeling of competency. And the third one is a sense of community. And in my own experience, I think right on. Like I really feel I have a lot of a sense of the first 2. Community, I'm kind of struggling with. And as I mentioned, many impoverished people do not struggle with that. Junger goes on to document, and this part of his book is so like page turner-ish, that when the Europeans were first colonizing the Americans, you would have Europeans either wander into or get captured by the various Native American tribes. It was a rare instance that these Europeans would want to leave those tribes. And it was unheard of that anyone in a tribe would want to go live with the Europeans because they had such an intense sense of community. The other thing, not in my outline, but I remember because I'm doing okay on time here, shockingly, that he also talks about the relative low frequency of PTSD in the country of Israel. And he says he theorizes the reason for that is that in Israel, every citizen, except for the ultra-Orthodox, are required to be in military service. So everyone knows what it's like. So when someone goes and sees active combat and has a traumatic experience, they are, if you will, held by the community. There's another fellow whose name I can't remember. He wrote some really famous papers. I think he's a sociologist. One of them is "The Iraqi War Did Not Occur." That's the title of the paper. And the reason is that because of my work at Rose City Center, there were several veterans that came through the training program at Rose City Center. It was fascinating to get to know these were both young men, but these folks are like separated from our society. They go off to war and they go back to Oklahoma or Kansas, and you don't really get to know them in the way that, say, during World War II, everyone had knew someone or had a sibling that was directly impacted by the war. Really, since Vietnam, that doesn't happen anymore. And that's what's so kind of provocative about this guy's two different papers he wrote. And I think he also wrote this great book called Simulation in Simulcra, which is about, you know what, I won't go into what it's about. I made my point. What a sad irony, and here you can understand one of the positives of impoverishment is that isolation, social isolation has now emerged as a serious problem in the developed world. The Surgeon General of the United States, not necessarily a source of the most accurate information, nonetheless has now proclaimed loneliness as a health emergency right in our own wealthy United States of America. The World Health Organization similarly documented social isolation on an international level. They estimate that 1 in 4 older people feel lonely and live isolated lives. Between 5 and 15% adolescents have similar alienated experiences. Also, well documented that social isolation, when present over a period of years, adversely affects physical and mental health, quality of life, longevity. Its effects on mortality equals that of other risk factors like smoking, obesity, and physical inactivity. So how does impoverishment interact with philosophy and psychology? Well, one of the biggest critiques of existentialism when it was so popular during the 50s and 60s was that's all well and good for you rich people to be talking about freedom of choice and ideas like self-actualization, but you cannot do that if you are impoverished. And you know what? Their critique was right on and accurate. Now, that doesn't mean you don't find meaning in life if you're impoverished, as I've already kind of integrated into the talk earlier, but you're not going to have a lot of freedom to find out who you really are, to realize that you're working as a barista at Starbucks and you become depressed. And then you think, you know what, I'm interested in the law. I think I need to find a way to get a scholarship and finish my bachelor's degree and go to law school and be who I am. be who you are. They don't have that luxury. When it comes to Erikson stages, just consider that first stage, basic trust versus mistrust. So many of these infants are not going to have that experience of basic trust. And I'm annoyed with the Israelis that they are not, and with Hamas, by the way, I kind of hold them equally responsible for this mass killing of civilians and impoverishment of the rest of the Gazan territory that is not only going to create severe mental disorders, but it's going to definitely breed new terrorists going into the future. Or think about what we talked about in terms of all of us here, generativity versus stagnation. How can you be quote unquote generative if you're just trying to spend every day surviving, not getting killed by a warlord, trying to live on $1 a week, etc. Now, there are notable exceptions, and I have a great note to myself here. AK, if running out of time, skip to below. So the exceptions are people like Nelson Mandela, who was born in a dirt-floored hut to a polygamist father who had 5 wives, and he had like 13 or 14 children. And as you probably all know, he rose to fame after serving 27 years in prison. He was in prison for his democratic activism and his anti-apartheid work. There is an unusual exception. And in Iran, there's a woman named Azar Nafizi who wrote the book Reading Lolita in Tehran. She was not imprisoned, but she was fired from her university job because she refused to wear a hijab. And then she later got, some years later, but her book is about this kind of underground reading group for women in Iran. So, skipping past more detail about those two, and I move now toward a final conclusion. As I hope I've presented to all of you today, the meaning is always present, whether conscious or not. There is a kind of oppositional fellow I see sometimes in the gym. He reads my Substack newsletter, which I will give any of you a free subscription to if you just email me. I don't care about the money as much as I care about people reading my ideas. And I wrote on this topic today as a way to kill 2 birds with one stone. I mean, yesterday I was working on this outline and I thought, let's make a Substack newsletter. And he emailed me to say, in religious belief systems like Jainism, they don't believe in meaning. They believe in living. And I haven't had a chance to email him back, but my email, their meaning is living. That is their meaning. I do agree with the existentialists that we are meaning-making beings. That's what our little frontal cortex allows us to do. And whether you're conscious of it or not, you have a meaning. I didn't get to throw in the pun not intended there. Martin Heidegger has this idea, he calls it thrownness. That's literally his word. And it's a nice way to evade the guilt that any of you might feel like me at the fortune we have of having born in a country like this. And he talks about how you have no control out of the thrownness, the roll of the dice that you were born here instead of in Somalia, where your life would be so different. And my question about some of these communities, well, really about the cultural religious traditions were they chosen Were these people able to choose? Were they able to be the kind of common Catholic, Jew, Christian in America that goes to college and then goes, I'm not so sure I'm really into Catholicism anymore. As far as community goes, I really can't see any downside. It likely provides not much comfort if you're running away from warlords all the time. And there is an ambiguity there because, as I mentioned, in areas when there's no community structure, you'll get gang formation, and then the affiliation doesn't really work in the same way, obviously. So I have a note here, only if you have time. And it's 7:51. Can we think I can do 2 more minutes before taking questions?
Absolutely.
Okay,
Go for it.
cool. So there's this obscure French psychoanalyst. If you ever want to read about him, I write about him quite a bit in my weekly newsletters, but his name is Jacques Lacan, Lacan, terrible writer. If you want to read about him, it's better to read people that write about his writings. Actually, he wrote almost nothing. He gave seminars and then people transcribed his seminars. But I think he's got the best definition of depression I've ever seen, definitely better than the DSM-5 or the ICD-10. Because Lacan's model is based upon the idea that we all have, he uses the French word for desire, meaning desire broadly defined. I think a lot of Americans, when they hear the word desire, they think about sexual desire, but he means desire broadly defined, to have a career, to help people, to be a virtuous person, whatever it is. And according to Lacan, you need to always desire something. The worst thing that could happen to you would be to have all your desires met, and that's pretty much impossible anyway. But that's all a preparation for his definition of depression, which is I have to add another side point. Your desire also informs your meaning. If you're a superficial materialist person, maybe like Jeff Bezos, who has a yacht so large that there is another ship that follows it all the time to provide logistical support for the yacht that he's on. Well, then things like helicopters and airplanes and $100,000 watches and stuff are meaningful to you. That's what you desire. But Lacan's concept of depression, which I presented to a depressed patient at 11:30 this morning, mostly because I think she felt more understood by it. It's that when you lose your desire and you also no longer see yourself as an object of desire. So you both lose your wish to be virtuous, to be giving, to be a good Catholic. All that outside stuff goes away, and you can't imagine why anyone would desire to hang out with you. Thank you for listening to my talk this evening. Again, Kim, really appreciate you inviting me. I felt honored by it. And now I'm ready for questions, comments, or any personality critiques. I'm always interested in those as well.